Yes, you're live. You can start.
Okay, thank you. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Kira Messinger. I represent the European Platform for Democratic Elections. I want to warmly welcome you to this third webinar in our series as part of the project Supporting Engagement in European Elections and Democratic Societies, which we're conducting together with our colleagues at the European Partnership for Democracy, Election Watch, and Democracy Reporting International. So in this webinar series, in which we're looking at issues ahead of the European Parliament elections next year, we previously discussed the issues of equality and inclusion, transparency in European elections, and today we will look at the issue of accountability. So we want to follow the money in the European elections and look at how political finance is regulated and who holds the contestants accountable in these elections. We know that money in elections can be a very inscrutable issue, but it impacts so many aspects of political life, so it is worth looking at it in more detail. So in the context of the European elections, it is important to look at this closely and to ask whether the regulations in place respond to the needs of the EU as a community of shared values and principles. With the EPTE, we recently last year published a study where experts who are also represented on this panel today, thank you for joining us again and talking about this issue, analyzed the diversity in political finance regulations across the EU. My colleague just shared the link to the study in the chat if you want to peruse it in more detail. So we see that it's more natural to find less regulation of finance in countries where there's a higher level of public trust and tighter regulations there where public trust is lower. However, there are emerging challenges faced by nearly all member states across the EU that transcend state borders and which will most definitely become issues also in the EU elections. So given this fact, it requires an examining of the existing regulations so that we look at if these still suit our needs and the challenges that we all face. So these thoughts lead us to consider two things, which we'll also discuss in this webinar, namely how these discrepancies in political finance oversight can affect issues like equality of opportunity for electoral contestants and transparency in the European elections, and how the EU could become a promoter of best practices regarding issues of accountability. And this is especially relevant in the context of these emerging trends like disinformation, transparency, or the role of the online domain. So before I hand over to our very capable moderator, Alexander Schlick, an international election expert and former head of the election department at the OSCE ODIHR, who will guide us through this discussion. Just a very quick reminder for our audience and also a note for those who maybe didn't join us in the previous webinars that you can state your questions to the panelists in the Q&A function here in Zoom. And we will make sure to pass these on to Alex and the speakers when we get to the Q&A section. And that this webinar is being recorded on YouTube so that people who couldn't join us today can view it later and to keep this discussion for posterity, of course. And we will be sharing some polls for you in the chat just to engage you a little bit more in this discussion. So keep an eye out for that. And with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Alex. Please take the floor. Oh, you're still muted,
Thank you
Alex.
very much, Kira. Hi, everyone. I'm, as always, delighted to see so many familiar faces and names, the faces amongst the speakers today and the names amongst the attendees. It's a pleasure to be here today with Kira, with all our distinguished speakers, and with all of you attending this webinar. Indeed, this discussion will build on the study that we prepared last year with the EPDE to look at the regulation of political finance at both the European Union and the national level. Barbara Joanne-Stonestreet is here with us as one of the panelists, as one of the co-authors. And I want to also acknowledge Septimius Paravu, who has been also our co-author of this study. He's not here with us, but I thought it would be appropriate to mention him here as well. It should be noted from the outset that there are discrepancies between these two levels, the EU level and the national level, in the regulation of political finance, both in the technical sense, but also in terms of philosophy and the political approaches to the regulation. But the good news is that there is a lot in common in Europe between the EU level and the member states' regulations. The key thing that is in common is the focus on the three most important principles: equality of opportunity, transparency, and accountability. And today we will focus specifically on the topic of accountability. As I mentioned, the two sets of regulations coexist at the EU and the member state level, with rather few interactions. This poses the first general question for our discussion today. How is this possible to reconcile the EU and the national level regulations to enhance accountability across the EU region? And this is a technical question of how. But this technical question is linked fundamentally to the political question of why the common accountability across the EU region matters. The reason that it matters is because we are speaking of a political process that is EU-wide. We're speaking in the context of the next European Parliament elections getting closer and closer. The elections to the European Parliament matter because the European Parliament matters. It takes decisions on a wide range of issues and topics, and these decisions impact the lives of citizens across the EU member states throughout the Union. There are also European political families of political parties, and some would say even political parties of the European scale. That said, the elections to the European Parliament remain very much a national matter. A wide range of rules exist and apply at the national level, but there's also an ongoing reform of the approaches at the European level. So you can see how I'm oscillating already between the national and the EU level considerations. Hence comes the second question: what is the role of the European Union in promoting best practices amongst the European Union member states concerning accountability in the political finance sphere? There is a firewall between the EU and the national level legislation concerning how European political parties can be funded and can participate in the elections. Can and should this firewall be eliminated? These are rather general questions, I understand, to get us thinking in the context of this discussion. I will be sure to propose more specific and more pointed questions to each of the speakers, because I want to, for all of us to benefit from their very unique and very deep expertise. But before we turn to our first speaker, I want to also let you know that we will run some short polls to get direct input from the audience, from you, the attendees on this topic. Please use the link that will be circulated in the chat to participate and answer the polls that will appear, and then we will be the answers to which we will be presenting here. We can by now get to the first question in the poll. The link I already see has been shared in the chat, so please feel free to click on it. And the first question is, who should be taking the lead in overseeing the funding and spending of contestants during the European elections? You have several possible answers here. Mostly the individual EU member states, mostly the European Union itself, both EU only for European political parties and EU-wide campaigns, and EU member states for their national contestants, none of the above, and the question that we don't want you to use, but just in case, I don't know. I'm sure since you're here in the audience, you probably have an opinion and you probably know what you want to share with all of us. Let us now turn to our discussion with and between the panelists. They are all wonderful experts in their own right, and bringing them together here means that we can spend hours discussing this topic. But we have to finish by 17:15 this time zone, and this means that each speaker will have about 7 minutes to answer about 2 questions to start with, and to also leave time for a good discussion with the audience and amongst the experts. Colleagues, I do ask you to be concise. And let's now turn to our first speaker. Shari Hinds is the policy officer on the EU political integrity at Transparency International EU. Here's my first question to you, Shari. A very general one, but I think it's a good one to kick off our meeting with. What are the main regulations in place at the EU level regarding the financing of electoral contestants for the 2024 European elections? Here you go, Shari.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, good. Yeah, thank you, Alexander, for the question, and thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. So Basically, Regulation 1141 of 2014 provides the rule on funding of European political parties and foundations. Basically, the European Commission presented a new legislative package on in November 2021 to reinforce the democracy and ensure integrity of the election, including, of course, the European election. The package includes also basically 4 different legislative proposals, and among them there is the proposal to recast, so reform Regulation 1141, and basically now the situation is that the Parliament amended and voted on the report to recast the regulation, and this was done in September 2022. And basically, I will maybe speak about this later, but in general, to ensure a fair election and to accountable election, and also to have the highest standards possible, the amendments of the regulation should enter in force in basically spring 2023. So now, so basically 1 year before the election. And basically, when it comes to the election, there is one interesting provision for us as Transparency International that is related to the transparency of the funding, and basically the Commission is as proposed to in the 6 months prior to the election to the European Parliament, donations received by the European political party and foundation, as well as expenditure funded from those donations, should be reported on a weekly basis to the authority for the European political parties and European political foundation. So this is in a way to increase the transparency, but of course accountability as well. And so as Transparency International, you were working on different provision related to accountability and transparency in this process of recast.
Thank you very much, Shari. I think it is important that the revised regulation will be entering into force soon enough, and a year before the 2024 European Parliament elections. You've already touched on this, but thanks for leaving that for my next question. In the view of the Transparency International EU, what is possibly missing in the proposed amendments? Are the amendments going the full way and meet all of your expectations for how they should be revised and how they should be regulating the EP elections next year?
Yes, so thank you for the question. I will reply to it. Basically, I will firstly point out to some of the basically differences and the new amendments that have been proposed by the Parliament from the Commission proposal, and then I will give more like some policy recommendation from our side. So basically, as I was saying before, the Parliament amended and voted on the report to recast the regulation in September 2022. And basically, the problem with that is that the Parliament decreased the level of transparency on different issues and changed also important provision related to the accountability. And this would have allowed to have a better oversight of the European political parties and funding spending, as well as their funding, of course. So when it comes to the basically there are 2 main issues if we compare the new proposal of the Parliament compared to the one of the Commission. So just briefly, one is the provision related to the transparency for political ads. So basically the Commission proposed to have more information on that and to have the political parties to give this information within 5 days. So basically the information related to the political ads, and the Parliament removed these 5 days working deadline. And at the same time, there is also another important provision that is not present anymore in the new proposal of the Parliament, and that was present in the one of the Commission, which is the fact that the member states should designate an authority, national regulatory authority, to supervise compliance with the requirement on political ads. So this is related to political ads, but then when it comes really to contribution and donation, the possibility of receiving basically contribution and donation from member parties that are they sit outside the union was present both in the commission and the parliament amendments. But the problem is that the parliament has gone far because has allowed even more participation to basically members member and non-members outside the union. The idea of the commission was to have contribution that were from members located in countries belonging to the Council of Europe, and while the Parliament has increased that, so the Parliament has introduced a new definition, which are basically they are called association fees. This association fee would be the definition is payment by bank transfer, by party or organization associated to basically political parties or foundation, having they sit outside the European Union. So basically the parliament test is now having, so the association fees are capped to 20%, while for the commission was 10%. So the problem with this for us at Transparency International is that this new provision, if they are not accompanied with more accountability, more transparency, they can be problematic and they can also lead to foreign interference. So this is really related more on a general perspective to the change that have been introduced from the Parliament. We as Transparency International really supported the Commission proposal because has higher standards of accountability and transparency. And so in general terms, when it comes to funding, I will now speak briefly about our policy recommendation in general on this. So it would be to have the anonymous donation should be lowered. Very simple, can be from 1,500 to 100. I know that it's really very little, but just because we would need to have more information on that, and we would like also to have more information by the authority of political parties, but also in general by the Parliament as soon as possible to allow accountability. We also think that single donations that are more than 1,000 should be immediately reported. And in general, we would like also to see this information, as I was saying, so basically in the 6 months prior to the European election, there should be information on donation should be done, and also expenditure should be reported on a weekly basis, as the Commission is proposing. And then finally, as more general, we would like to have this information, all information regarding the funding should be published in an open, machine readable format, citizen friendly, and in order indeed to allow some real accountability. And then the last thing I want to say is that basically now that the Parliament has adopted this report, the file is basically under negotiation. The negotiators are speaking right now about this, and we would like the negotiation to increase the level of accountability of the text. Yesterday there have been basically a meeting of the Working Party on General Affairs that discuss the proposal, the amendments right now, and tomorrow there will be a trilogue, so between the Parliament on this. So we hope that the negotiation will take the opportunity to increase the level of accountability. Thank you for the
Thank you very much, Shari. And I think we've already noted, you've already noted quite a number of additional suggestions that are extremely practical. And I think that this is really good. We will probably be getting back to those. And I think the best way to get back to those is to start getting into the details of how the election campaigns in this European Parliament elections are taking place. And we cannot but admit recognizing that these campaigns and these elections are happening at the national level. So our next speaker is Lina Petronene, representing she's the head of division of political parties and political campaigns funding control of the Central Election Commission of Lithuania. I'm delighted to pass on the floor to you, Lina. And the first question that I have for you, and I think that this is a very practical question. Is there a legal distinction between campaigning in the member state and the national campaign and holding a European campaign in the territory of your state? This is more of an opening question because I think we'll get into even more details later on. But there you go, Lina. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Alex. I think I would like to share my slides because it will be easier to have some illustration. Can you see it or not?
Yes, if you could make it bigger, then we can see it easier as well.
You can see it, yes. And now we are switching, yes. So Central Electoral Commission, or CEC of Lithuania, conducts all kinds of election and controls over financing of political campaigns and political organizations. And speaking about European Parliament election, I would like to pay attention to legal framework of Lithuania regarding participation in elections, nominating candidates, and of certainly rules of financing of political campaigns. So in Lithuania, the members of European Parliament are elected by proportional system, and the list of candidates may be nominated only by national political organizations, political parties, or political committees, which are registered according to Lithuanian laws at least 6 months before election day. And candidates.
Lina, you can move to the next slide.
I can. We didn't move, but I cannot.
No.
Okay, I'll try to go to find the.
You can switch to the presentation mode and then move to the next slide.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Now I can see. Okay. So candidates can be only citizens of Lithuania or residents of Lithuania, which are citizens of EU member states, and we have to live in Lithuania at least 60 days before election day. So only national organizations can participate in elections in Lithuania and to European Parliament. And what are legal financing of political campaigns? Only donation of natural persons and candidates, and natural persons are citizens of Lithuania or residents of Lithuania, which are citizens of EU member states. And we have several limits. Then average monthly earnings, which is almost 18,000 euro next year for European Parliament election, and no more than 10% of donors' annual income. This means that candidates and donors, before donating more than 50 euros during political campaign, must declare their income. And this is checked. Also, political organizations may transfer their funds to account of political campaign and to use this money, and interest of funds kept in the bank account of political campaign, but this is very small, so we don't have to speak about them. And we have also some limits on participants of political campaign, but only registered participants of political campaign may pay expenses of political campaign, and only registered participants may order and pay for political advertising. So no European political parties, we cannot directly or indirectly participate in our national political campaign. We have limits of expenditure. It is 2.2 million euro for a list of candidates to European Parliament. And if a limit is exceeded before election, the CEC may oblige the participant to stop ordering new services, making new contracts. And we have some gross violation of election code, which are related to limits of expenditure. For example, exceeding the limit of 10% is considered as gross violation of election code. During political campaign, our political campaign is 6 months before election day. So during political campaign, income and expenses are declared to CEC within 10 working days after receiving it. And we are declared using our information system. And all income, all expenditure are checked with different registers. Whether a person has a right to donate, if donation doesn't exceed the limit, total amount of expenditure doesn't exceed the expenditure limits, and etc. And about 80% of all political campaign expenditure goes to political advertising. So media and monitoring and political advertising producers provide the information about political advertising also. Also, the CEC and lower level electoral commissions monitor political advertising. Sometimes we hire a company which does it for us. all this information about income, about expenditure, about political advertising is published on the website of CAC. So it is no anonymous donations. Only if a donor donated less than 50 euros per participant, we publish the total amount of donation, but we don't publish the name of a donor. In other case, we publish names of donors. And after election, all reports are checked by independent auditors, and the reports on auditor spendings also are published on our website. And I have to say, it's not enough to receive all reports and to publish them, but we need to check them. So after election, all reports are checked, as I mentioned, are checked by auditors, and also information about political advertising from media, from participants of campaign and monitoring companies and the election commission are analyzed, compared, and we check if there are some hidden expenditure or even hidden funding of some political advertising. And if it is established that a political campaign participant has accepted and used funds or an in-kind donation from person or entity who has no right to donate, or the donation increase the limits, so it is illegal funding in Lithuania, and the CAC takes a decision to obligate the political campaign participant to transfer the relevant amount to the state budget within 20 working days. So I think we have quite a comprehensive system of accountability, and in case some European political party would pay, I don't know, for political advertising in favor of one political party, it would be considered as political advertising of this political party, and we would look for limits and for funding funds. And it is, as I said before, it is illegal in Lithuania to receive any other funds except of natural person candidates and the national political organizations. So. And
I think that this is one of the key findings and one of the key things that I wanted to reiterate based on your presentation, Lina. Thanks a lot for outlining the details of the national level regulations. And this is where I think the key of the issue under discussion today is. I'm sure we'll get back to the details. Unfortunately, the slides were not moving, I understand, but I think that the participants were quite interested to hear from you directly on the national level regulations. What you concluded with, I think, is fundamental, that under your legislation, whatever comes from the European Union level or European political party is still interpreted within the limits of a donation to the national electoral participant. So what we can say in the very general terms is that, yes, you are electing members of the European Parliament, but you are electing them in Lithuania using Lithuanian rules. Hence, I think this is a fantastic moment to switch on to Barbara, to our next speaker, who is the senior legal expert with the French National Commission on Campaign Accounts. So enjoying her perspective on the national level, and the political, and also the co-author of the EPD study, who has also, I want to reveal, has authored quite a number of things on the EU level regulations as well. So Barbara has a very good perspective on the EU level regulations as well. So this combination allows me to pose the following question to Barbara. Also looking at what Lina has presented, what is the main discrepancy between the EU level and the national level political finance regulations in the EP elections, apart from the fact that they actually coexist? And maybe also looking ahead, what could be the good strategies on how to bridge this gap, how to actually have these two systems coexist in a way that is not contradicting one another, but hopefully even reinforcing one another. I pass the floor to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Alex, for asking me this very interesting question. I think I would start by saying that speaking about national political finance regulations comes down to talking about 27 different political finance systems that reflect the wide diversity of regulatory approaches to political finance adopted by the different member states. And obviously the differences in political finance regulations across the EU region have an impact on the enforcement mechanisms and accountability systems in place in the member states, as the scope, the nature, and the level of detail of political finance regulations vary from one member state to another. As mentioned by Alex, these two systems of regulations coexist and get to interplay somehow every 5 years on the occasion of the European parliamentary elections with, however, really limited interactions. Discrepancies are particularly significant as regards the adhesion to implementation of the key principles mentioned by Kira in our introductory remarks: equality, transparency, accountability, but also as regards the role played by political actors. As regards the key principles, a few examples drawn upon the EPD study that was published last year. I think that we all understood that spending limits are established by member states. Lina just mentioned that in the Lithuanian example. And while in most member states, there is a spending limit that electoral contestants and sometimes non-electoral contestants have to comply with, there is no such spending limit at the EU level. And this state of affairs directly impacts the principle of equality between electoral contestants at the EU level, whose expenses are not capped, and electoral contestants at the member state level, who for the vast majority have to comply with a set spending limit. Second example, the EU regulatory framework lays down rules that mostly pertain to political party financing, except for regulations regarding the reporting and publication of donations during the campaign period. European political parties are not subjected to other campaign finance reporting requirements. And actually, this is at odds with the practice of most member states as regards campaign finance reporting requirements. And the third point that stems actually from this observation is that this situation impacts the accountability mechanisms at the EU level, since there is no control, there is no verification carried out during the campaign and actually before the European political parties submit their annual financial reports to the authority for European political parties and European political foundations. So yes, accountability systems vary greatly from one member state to another. And although most member states have vested one single institution with political finance supervision, at the EU level, it's very interesting to see that the authority's mandate is split with other national and European oversight institutions. And one could argue that the existence of several institutions having a mandate over political finance doesn't necessarily square with a more effective supervision of, as the authority has never used to date, its sanctioning power. The second set of discrepancies before actually getting into strategies that could be envisaged actually to gap the bridge between these two levels, it's also the role played by political actors. As mentioned by Alex, EU elections remain a national matter. And there's a clear distinction between European political parties that are seen as party alliances or parties of parties, as opposed to national parties, which are parties of citizens and individuals. And the existence of a financial firewall that prevents European political parties from participating in national campaign remain the main obstacle. So what kind of strategies could be envisaged to bridge the gap between these two levels? As mentioned by Kira, but also pointed out by Alex and Sherry, all existing political finance systems across the EU region are challenged by the same newly emerging trends: online political advertising, foreign influence, and the use of third parties actually to circumvent existing rules. And that shows there's a need to adopt rules at the EU level to come up with common responses to these trends and threats. So obviously, the diversity of political finance remits across the EU region makes it almost impossible to develop universal enforcement mechanisms or implementation approaches. However, the establishment of coordination and cooperation mechanisms between the EU and member states, the member state level, and at the national level between the member states themselves would help set up common approaches to similar issues. For instance, that would be could be envisaged to require third parties to register with the authority, and there would be a register of third parties that the authority would be in charge of. Another option could be to set up a network of oversight bodies under the control of the authority, with the possibility of having a bilateral cooperation agreements. And to wrap up, I just would like to make a final comment to maybe elaborate on and maybe further a little bit some ideas touched on by the previous speakers. Could a simple solution to bridge the gap between the EU and the member state level as regards enforcement and accountability mechanisms be to remove the financial firewall and national regulations that prevent European political parties from campaigning in member states? European political parties would then become fully fledged electoral actors required to comply with the two layers of political finance regulation, and we could be held responsible in case of non-compliance.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And I think this feeds wonderfully into what I wanted to discuss next with Quentin. Let me, since you were the last speaker for the introductory remarks, Quentin, I think it's time to heat up the discussion before we get into the Q&A session. And I encourage everybody to submit their questions, to pose their opinions in the Q&A section before we move on to the discussion amongst the panelists. But I think it's always a good thing to be a little bit more provocative before we get there. And I'm grateful to Barbara for already outlining the possible limitations that the European political parties face in campaigning at the European Parliament elections that are, as we keep repeating, are actually happening at a national level. And Lena so wonderfully outlined what the national level regulations are like, highlighting that they are plentiful and very detailed. And I want to pose a question to you, Quentin. And Quentin Reed is the political finance expert engaged in research on national provisions affecting European political parties and European political foundations, precisely what we're discussing here today. My question to you is twofold. First is, what are the major barriers that are faced by the EU political parties campaigning in the European Parliament elections? But my second side of this question is, what are the European political parties? Do they really exist? Are we speaking of the entities that we want to have in reality, that we are imagining to ourselves because we want to see the European level political process? Or are they really the actors that are already either very much involved in the European Union level political process, or are hungry to be involved and are facing serious barriers for their participation? The floor is yours, Quentin. I don't have answers to this, and I very much hope that you do.
Okay, thank you, Alexander. I hope that you can hear me. My internet connection went a bit unstable a couple of times. Good, it's okay now. Okay, these are good questions. I think in one way it's almost the same question, and it's on barriers to European political parties as European political parties participating in elections, European elections. I was hired by the authority last year to kind of map the differences in regulation of the funding and spending of European political parties as entities in European elections. And in the course of this, a lot of this was quite boring, sort of mapping and regulation. There isn't much regulation of European political parties directly at national level. But what I did come across, which was most important, I think, is what I think is potentially a very serious barrier to European political parties as European political parties participating in elections. So what's the problem? Regulation 1141 basically says that European political parties can spend money, any of their funds, on campaigning, as long as it's identified and reported clearly. Secondly, however, they are not allowed to finance national parties in any way. Now, what problem does that create? I think the problem is that if a European party spends money on campaigning in a member state, whatever type of campaigning that is, and a national party there is one of the members of that European political party, then in many countries, and at least in the general logic of political finance, this would be seen as an in-kind donation to the national party that's benefiting. And that's illegal under Regulation 1141 because it's a donation. Now it's difficult to map to what extent this is the case in member states, because it would partly depend on interpretation of the regulator in cases and so on. But all member states do classify donations of provision of goods and services for free or at favorable terms as in-kind donations. That's quite clear. So, and it's notable that Latvia states explicitly that expenditure by a European political party on a pre-election campaign is not considered as a donation to a national party. So Latvia has found it necessary to state that that is not the case, which would imply that if it was not there in their law, then this would be a problem. Yeah. So in-kind donation is a in-kind, European political party spending being seen as an in-kind donation to national parties is a problem. If it's not seen as an in-kind donation, then it would seem that it would be third-party campaigning, probably. In other words, independent campaigning by a non-electoral subject. That's not regulated in many countries, but it's forbidden in some countries. And it's a bit of an uncertain area at the moment. So, if you look at the member states, in 8 member states, I think, from my mapping of the regulation, only political parties or other nominating organizations in country are permitted to campaign. 4 countries explicitly prohibit campaigning by third parties, and all member states classify what I said already, provision of goods and services for free or at favorable conditions as in-kind donations. So, where does this leave us? And I think the position of the authority, and this is what was communicated to me directly, is that you can get around this by having a distinction between campaigning in a European election by national parties at national level and campaigning by European parties at European level. And they're 2 different types of campaigning. And so the authority has provided an attempt at defining this in their annual activity report for 2020, I think, where European campaigns, in other words, not national European campaigns, but European campaigns are such because they are carried out in several member states. They focus on European topics, that affect more than one country at the same time. They are carried out only in the context of an EU election. They're clearly authored by EU parties. And finally, the campaigns must be compatible with applicable national law, whatever that means. Now, if this did solve the problem, so, you know, if you're talking about European party spending, it would only be on this kind of campaigning. Whereas if you're talking about national party spending, it would be only on national party campaigning within country in the European election. Maybe that would be all right, but the problem is that this is just a few paragraphs in an annual activity report. It's not stated anywhere in a regulation or law. And that not being the case, there is no clear distinction between a European campaign and a national European campaign. So I think that there is potentially a serious barrier to European parties actually spending money in member states on campaigns.
Thank you. Thank you, Quentin. I think this is a very interesting conclusion that you arrived at, while at the same time highlighting that there is a thinking going on what is the European Party, how to actually legislate for the campaigns at the European level that we actually see happening. And I think that this is a very interesting moment to reflect on something that where a number of you highlighted what the European Union level regulation could be addressing. And I'm drawing on a number of questions that we already have in the Q&A. There was a question from Mikko Salo, and another comment from Mikko that touches upon something where the European Union level regulation can actually have a very interesting impact, specifically because in the number of member states, the national level regulation is lagging behind the reality. And what I'm speaking about is the campaigning online. And that is a part of where the big thinking is happening in the European Commission and in the European Parliament. And I wanted to pose the following question to both Shari and Lina as well. To Shari and Lina to speak about very briefly on the what are your thoughts on how successful is this new revised regulation at the European Union level going to be with regard to regulating the campaign activities that are taking place online? To Shari, because you have the pan-European perspective from the perspective on the political integrity, and to Lina to also share the experiences briefly of how you are dealing with the online political financing and the monitoring and the oversight. And we've recently spoken about it with Lina, and I know that Lithuania is doing quite a lot in this domain. But for both of you, I would want to also not only share your perspectives on it, but to also look at it from the topic that Quentin touched upon, that the European Union political parties can actually have a pan-European campaign going on exactly because they can be campaigning on the online sphere, where they can reach a lot of different voters across the borders. So that is where I feel that there is a scope for the regulation, and there is really a scope for the creation and coming into real political being of the European political parties. But to you, Shari and Lina, maybe Shari first, how successful is this going to be? Very briefly, I think I want to pose another round of questions later on, so let's keep some time for that. Shari first, please.
Yes, thank you for your question. I think it's a very interesting question. So we are really working a lot on this new proposed regulation. It's actually not me that follows that in Transparency International, but another colleague. But in general, what I can say is that already in the proposal, in the regulation 1141, there is a provision on transparency requirement for political ads. This is Article 5, and we think that in general it's very important to have this transparency to allow citizens to see actually information on the ads. And we think that these two instruments can go together, of course, because the regulation for transparency political ads would be central in political context, and of course also in the election. But at this level, when we try to link it to funding of European political parties, we think there is a huge opportunity with Article 5 of the regulation 1141. And in this sense, we support the proposal of the Commission. They are trying to have more information to limit the time when this information should be given. They are also clearly asking for this information to be citizen friendly, accessible, clear, visible, and so on. and they want to designate a particular national regulatory authority. So I think that this article can really be key in the negotiation, because of course regulation for transparency of political ads is also central, but these two instruments should go together, and huge opportunities there with Article 5 of the regulation.
Thank you very much, Shari. I will now pass on the floor back to Lina with the reiterated question on what do you think, Lina, this EU-level regulation of this new emerging sphere of campaigning, given that you are already doing a lot, do you think that the EU-level regulation will help you or will change the way that you're doing things? And let's face it, you are quite successful in tackling the oversight, this impossible very much task of oversight of political finance online.
Yes, we use public available information about advertising on social media. We use libraries, we use reports, and we compare this information, we take it, and we hope for more efficient cooperation with social media to receive more quickly information, particularly in case where we have some accounts which doesn't belong to politicians and so on, because sometimes we have paid political advertising and their algorithm didn't recognize it as political advertising, and we have some troubles to get information who paid for this political advertising. So we hope more efficient contacts with social media. And yes, we use since 2019 information from public available from Facebook at library. We export the reports and we compare with our information provided by participants of political campaign. We analyze it.
Thank you so much. This is, I think, a really good moment to launch a poll on, there is please take a look at the chat. There will be a link to the poll, and this is a poll where you can provide a short answer, your opinion, your viewpoints, and as you type in, I think it would be extremely interesting to also hear from the expert on it, and then we will see in parallel tracks what your opinions are and what the opinion of one of the speakers is. The question is, what kind of role do European political parties play, if any? Please type in whatever your answers are. Try to be concise, but express yourselves. And I think that this is a good moment to also ask Quentin for a brief comment on what are the European Union political parties? What are they really doing? What can they be doing? Or how do they even see themselves? Quentin.
Yeah, thank you, Alexander. I meant to mention this when I made my main remarks, but one of the other difficulties you asked about the barriers to European political parties campaigning. And I think one of the main ones, especially if European campaigning by a European party has to be, across several countries and addressing, general European issues, is that this is a very tall order. Especially if European political parties are only groupings of national parties. When I was gathering information for the study, I was asking member states for whatever implementing legislation they had, or legislation in addition to 1141, etc. Spain replied back to me saying there is no such thing as a European political party. There are only political groupings of parties in the European Parliament. They didn't even know that they exist. So, there's a big question here is, do these parties actually do anything in terms of campaigning? Because I've never seen one in the Czech Republic where I live. And I think that national parties, at least where I come from, it's the last thing that they would want is to have a European party there next to them. Because even voters of pro-European parties are a little bit skeptical. And I think a national party will be worried about a party that's never existed there suddenly coming in and campaigning next to them. I just don't know how this would work, and I don't know if it happens even. So there's a huge sort of elephant in the room here about what could European political parties do in terms of campaigning? Would they want to do that, and would national parties that are members of them want them to do that? Is this is this a real regulatory issue or not? I guess that's my point.
Thank you so much, Quentin. I think what you're saying is reflected very much in the answers that I see popping up on our screen. There is quite a bit of skepticism in these answers, none next to none in terms of what is the role of the European political parties. But I also see that there are some hopeful remarks there of the European political parties hopefully expressing or defending the interests of the EU as a whole, or expressing the values that are shared across the borders, or expressing the interests of the citizens of the European Union member states, thinking of themselves as the European citizens or Europeans. And I think that there are some mentionings there on interaction between the EU political parties and the national political parties. And I think that this is where I want to turn back to Barbara with a specific question. You started discussing this, the variety of the oversight mechanisms that exist across the European Union member states has been a fascinating topic for us to research for the EPD study last year. And Lina has also highlighted what their oversight body is doing. So the question here is, okay, we have this thinking at the European Union level that the activities, the role of the European political parties and European foundations can be regulated because they're doing something. At the same time, we all know that the role of the national oversight mechanisms is huge and it's not going to go away, also because the campaigns are run nationally. So the question is, given that the oversight mechanisms in the European Union member states, and let's face it, they're working pretty well by and large, there are issues here and there, but they're successful, they're rather successful in what they're doing. Will they be able to promote, will they be even interested in promoting what is the European political party, what European political parties are doing? Or will their focus still be maintained on the national political parties and the national electoral process? Is there a chance for a productive, good cooperation between the national oversight bodies and the EU level oversight body?
Actually, I think it's one of the most important questions, but it's a tricky one as well. Because I think that exerting oversight over political finance is very much a question of national sovereignty for a lot of member states. You know, just regulating and overseeing the relationship between money and politics is really a national matter. And I think, as mentioned by the different speakers, it is a reality that European elections are a national matter, and that the role played by European political parties is extremely minimal in that sense. Having in place coordination, cooperation mechanisms between the national oversight bodies and the European oversight body, just to enhance accountability in political finance, is obviously one of the key issues, and obviously would help improve the level of enforcement of EU level and national level regulations. I think that now your question has no answer as long as the role and the definition of European political parties is not clearly identified. And it's also an observation that, as mentioned by elections, it is very difficult to see what European political parties do in terms of campaigning, for the simple reason that they cannot campaign in member states because of the provisions that exist in Regulation 1141. So it's not only about looking at what could be done at the national level, it's just looking at what could be done at the EU level to facilitate the fluidity of exchange and information sharing between the EU and the national level.
Thanks a lot. And this, I think, brings me to the last question that I have. I'm keeping an eye on the questions that we have here. And what I had in mind is a spin-off of one of the questions in the Q&A section. In our discussion, and we're coming to a close here, I want to give a round to everybody for a brief comment on this. As we are speaking about the 2024 elections, we are in a slightly different reality versus the 2019 European Parliament elections. We have an undoubtedly big role and possibly negative role of the external actors, such as the Russian Federation, for example. It has been mentioned in one of the comments here. It is something to be wary about. It is something to be addressed. The possibility of the foreign influence is something not to be forgotten. We are in a situation where we are having more online political campaigning, but we're also a bit more conscious about what the online political campaigning is like and what the potential pitfalls are. There is more of it, but we know it better as well than we used to in 2019 when we were fresh after the Cambridge Analytica and we were still making up our mind about what this whole thing is. So the question is, I want to focus specifically on the role of the EU level regulation, oversight and enforcement of accountability in the political finance. Is the role in leading the way in the new terrains? Is the role in closing the gaps in the oversight and the accountability, the gaps that are left behind by some of the national level oversight bodies? Or is the role separate completely from the national level enforcement and oversight mechanisms? So national level deals with their own level, EU level deals with their own. So these are the three broad options that sprang to my mind. And I want you to maybe add another one or explain your choice between these ones. Leading the way in the new terrains, closing the gap left behind by the national level regulators, or separate from the national level. Let's move in the reverse order, starting from Quentin, going back. Quentin?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I guess one thought, though, a lot of what we've been talking about, or explicitly or implicitly, has been about the gap between EU level regulation of European parties and national regulation of national parties. I guess that my answer to your question may be that perhaps looking at this the other way around is one hope, that where there are issues that are actual national campaigning issues by national parties, but are of forms of campaigning that go across national boundaries, online is the obvious one, then that is where a European level regulator could play a role. But it's not being formulated in that way at all at the moment. It's seen as the APPF is responsible for regulating European parties only, but not national ones in any way at all. Maybe we should be looking at it a little bit differently, that in certain areas, the authority could actually empower national authorities to do their job more effectively.
Super, very interesting. And I think that's a very fresh perspective on things, especially as we know the campaigns are happening across the borders, not only in the EP elections, but often in the national elections as well, using the agents, using the same language, for example, across the border to influence the domestic election campaigns. Very interesting perspective also on possibly empowering the national level legislation, regulators. Barbara?
I think, there's also another aspect to your question, is that for rules to be enforced, one needs actually actors to comply with the rules and to be held accountable. So right now there are two sets of regulations that coexist and exist in parallel. But actually, just to close the gap between these two levels, to bridge the gap between these two levels, one needs to have actors that will need to comply with the regulations at the EU and national level, and that will need to be held accountable in case of non-compliance with regulations. And I think that's where I see European political parties as being vehicles actually to bridge the gap between these two levels. I think it's also that, the new emerging trends, the new emerging threats, online political advertising, foreign influence, third parties, all of these issues threaten the status quo, and answers at the EU level would help national oversight bodies to come up with solutions to effectively enforce new regulations and new rules, and having, you know, this kind of cooperation mechanisms in force, in having this network of regulators to address issues and come up with solutions would help actually to enhance the accountability mechanisms, but also to apply uniformly new regulations.
Super. Thank you so much, Barbara. Lina, do you agree? The European Union regulators coming to aid you?
I agree with Barbara that we need some cooperation, because separate countries, particularly Lithuania, is a small country, is not so easy to work with this, to exclude all risks. So I think we need this leading role. And of course, national institutions, we have to work also, not only EU level.
Super. I think it's a very important perspective that the national level oversight does not disappear. We're not about to replace it with the European Union level oversight. Shari, back to you. What's your opinion? Leading the way, closing the gap left behind, or separate completely from the national level oversight?
Yes, thank you. I think that they should go together. Of course, working a lot on the European Union. Of course, I think that the European Union has a leading role on these. Of course, with the possibility, and I think that this is also related to the issue of disinformation as well, that can be connected. And the European Union has done a lot of efforts in that direction. The action plan on disinformation, the code of practice, which also includes stuff related to, of course, interference and regulating these important matters. And I think that, of course, there is a good opportunity there for the European Union, and of course, the national side of it is also important.
Super. Thanks a lot. I think we're coming to your conclusions here. Does anyone have any pressing issue that we would want to highlight or that we omitted in the course of this discussion? I don't feel that way. I don't see the hands raising. Importantly, and I think Michael in the Q&A is pointing out a very important thing, that the negotiations, as we heard from Shari and the others, are still ongoing. The discussion is still live. We still don't have the final product. My personal feeling is that nothing will change fundamentally at this stage, but I think that this is still a discussion on the details and the thinking and the formulations in the document that has been released last autumn already, and many of us have already seen it. So I don't expect fundamental changes, but I do think that there could be some changes, and Shari, correct me if I'm getting it totally wrong, but there could be some changes to the ceilings and the parameters and the values in terms of what those oblige different actors to do. But I think that that's where most of the issues that could be changed are still ahead of us. But with that, am I correct, Shari?
Yes, it's true, but another very pressing issue where basically the Council and the Parliament have a completely different point of view, and also this is the reason why they decide to have one additional trilogues, basically, is related to the contribution, so the extension to the Council of Europe contribution, and basically the Parliament would like to extend it in line with the Commission proposal, where the Council is against that. It would only like to have a contribution from basically member state of the European Union.
Super, very interesting. I think it's time for us to conclude. In my opinion, it has been a very fruitful discussion. We've touched on fundamental issues of accountability, and we've done that both in terms of discussing what is the EU level, what is the national level, where are the borderlines between the EU level campaigning and political process and the national level campaigning and the political process. We've also spoken about the shared value and the shared importance of accountability from at the national level and at the EU level. And this is something where I feel obliged to comment, having served working with elections across a variety of countries. I am now speaking in the context of the EU level, and I cannot but say that things are actually working quite rather well. So let's not be pessimistic in our discussion. I think we're aiming for a very good solution in the system and in the context where things are already not drastically bad. So these are good news. Let's be optimistic. Let's not forget to be optimistic. I think that this has been a very interesting discussion as well, because we're still more than a year ahead of the next European Parliament elections, and we still need to monitor what the final product is, and we will still have time to analyze it, prepare for it, and get going with the observation, monitoring, and the analysis of the political and campaign process ahead of the 2024 European Parliament elections. I very much am grateful to the attendees for posing the questions here in the Q&A session. I want to comment that in the chat, there is also a link now to the evaluation form that we kindly ask you to click on and to leave your comments before you leave. A couple of final concluding remarks. I'm really grateful to the PDE and the partners for putting this wonderful panel together. I feel that we've had a perspective that is both analytical and very practical, that is coming from the EU level and the national level, and the perspective that I think will be quite interesting, and that's why I'm also glad that we have it recorded for posterity, that will be interesting to share beyond the European Union borders. I know for a fact that a lot of countries in the neighborhood of the European Union are looking at this ongoing reform process. They're doing so in the Western Balkans. They're doing that in Ukraine and Moldova in the Eastern Partnership. And I think that this is where our discussion has roots in the European Union, and has most of its focus in the European Union, but it is of importance beyond the borders of the European Union. That's an important thing that we're also achieving here. And maybe one last thing is that I think that what we cannot doubt is that there is a fundamental agreement within the borders of the European Union that accountability matters, that no matter what and how we regulate, no matter what and how we enforce, this major principle of accountability to which our today's seminar has been dedicated is something that is a shared value. What we're trying to achieve is to explore the ways on how to protect and ensure the accountability, and how to meet the new challenges and the new threats to the electoral processes in the European Union and at the European Union level. And I think that this is something that we hopefully contributed to with today's discussion. I'm very grateful to the organizers. I'm very grateful to all of the fellow panelists, Shari, Lena, Barbara, Quentin. Fantastic to be with you on the panel. And I think that this is a good moment for us to conclude and to say thank you to you all, and thank you to all the participants today.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for joining, and a kind reminder to join us for our 4th webinar on risks and opportunities in the European elections. Invitations to this following soon. Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.